What is Ask Data? Well, let me start with a simple question. How are recent sales for chairs in Cali? There's a lot of vagueness to that question. Recent, right? What defines recent? Is it a year, 6 months, a month? Sales? Maybe we have a different term for that. Maybe we refer to it as revenue, income, or something else. Chairs? Is chairs a product? Is it a category? Is it a product line? Cali? Well, we can infer or assume that that means California, but there's really no way to tell for sure. And so I'd ask you to think about how precise the interaction is between a machine and a person, as opposed to between two people. When you ask both Google Maps and another person how long it takes to get to a specific address on the other side of town, you'll get something very precise from a machine, 27 minutes from a machine, and something that's not quite as definitive, maybe about a half hour, from a human. Interacting with the machine usually requires you to be precise when talking to it, and the response you get back is precise. Whereas the interaction that normally takes place between people allows for some approximation, knowing that the other person inherently understands what you're telling them and can still draw the correct conclusion even though you're not exact. So this question on the screen is a very natural dialogue because our brain is really good at using common sense to infer the ambiguous terms like recent, and also at filling in the missing information such as chairs being a subcategory of products and Cali actually referring to the state of California. We want to enable you to have this natural experience when interacting with your data in Tableau. And so, why is natural language so hard? This is by no means an exhaustive list, but it's meant to give you just really a few examples of why that may be. So for as far as the importance of context, for that statement, 6-foot doctors work at the hospital, it's not 100% clear if we're talking about tall doctors or 6 actual podiatrists. In terms of the emphasis, to a computer, all words carry the same weight. Computers are very democratic. They don't understand that certain words have more impact than others when conveying a message. In idioms, for example, humans can understand or infer the meaning behind a statement like that even when the meaning is not specifically stated. So as many of you probably know, our mission here at Tableau is to help people see and understand data. It's not to help people with a BI background see and understand data. It's not to help analysts with a sophisticated knowledge of the data warehouse see and understand data. It's to help people. That's it. That's the bar. Our goal is to make it so that anyone, regardless of skill set or background, can work with our platform to interact with their data with no prerequisites. Tableau Desktop, since its very inception, has always illustrated that, and Ask Data is merely the next iteration of that focus. If you can Google, you can use Ask Data. So in this session, we'll talk about how to get started with Ask Data. I'll be going through a couple demonstrations and discuss what's necessary to use it. We'll talk about the NLP system capabilities, NLP of course being the acronym for Natural Language Processing. And we'll talk about some different analytical functions that are included and briefly show some examples of how Ask Data operates under the hood. And then we'll provide some tips, best practices, and available resources on how to get the most out of Ask Data, and more importantly, where you can go to begin testing it out for yourselves or your colleagues. So let's go ahead and get started with the demo here. Let me open up what I'm going to start with is Tableau Desktop. And the reason why I'm doing this is I want you to see what the flow is from beginning to end. So here I've got Tableau Desktop, and I will do a simple connection to a SQL Server database. And I'll pick my database. select one table just for our purposes here, and I see that I've got some sample data back. Now, if you're not familiar with Tableau Desktop, this is simply just establishing the connection to the underlying data. So this is a common task and something that if you have not done yourselves through Tableau Desktop, certainly colleagues have done for you to allow interactivity between data once this is published up. We won't be going too deep into this, but I at least wanted to see what this flow looks like. And all I'm going to do is publish this data source up to Tableau Server, or in my case, Tableau Online. So I'll publish this to the Sales Sandbox, and I'll give this a name. And I'll append my last name to it just for the sake of easy searching, as this is a fairly busy server that we're publishing to. And I'll just embed the data source password and say publish. Now, as Tableau is sending all the information around the data source, meaning the data type, or the database type, the driver, tables, etc., what's happening is now Ask Data is going into action. You see the changes in the list of questions here in the middle because the analysis process is currently taking place. So it looks like Ask Data is done. And before we get into the specifics of this, I want to show you really the more common way that you're going to be able to access this. So I'll come up to the very root of Tableau Server, or like I said, in this case, Tableau Online. And you'll see if you're, with the 2019.1 release, we've redesigned the landing page. So all content, whether it's projects, workbooks, views, data sources, or flows, you can view them all within just a single list here. If for some reason that's a little bit too much, you can, of course, change that and say, I only want to look at all data sources. Seeing that we're still looking at a fairly lengthy list, I'll just do a search for my last name and see if that shows up. We go to data sources with Levine, and there it is. So just a quick, easy way to search for it. And again, now that it's a published data source and I know how to find it, the landing page is going to be Ask Data. And by the way, as far as prerequisites, this works with Tableau Online, this works with Tableau Server, this works with extracts, and it works with live connections. So if it can be a published data source, you can use Ask Data on top of it. And what's happened here is part of the analysis process is Ask Data has looked at all the elements of the various fields. So you see as I hover over category, we see that the most common values are office supplies, furniture, and technology. Same thing with date fields, so the range of dates within the shipping date. Sales and profit, we see the range of values there. So this is some nice descriptive information because, again, I might be looking at this for the first time. And because I am, I could certainly start with one of the suggested questions. And if I click on that, it'll open up in a new window and provide me the response. Or I'll just close out and I'll start by asking my own questions. And I might just start with something simple, total sales. Now, total, obviously, that's a normal term that a human being would use. What's happening is Tableau is looking at that and saying, well, I think you mean sum of sales. So I'll go with that selection. And because we're just looking at that one measure, Ask Data is going to render a single number as a chart type. So now let's slice and dice this a little bit. Maybe let's look at this by category or subcategory. And there's no drag and drop here. There's no menu options to find your way through or navigate through. It's simply you add something if you want to include it. You can certainly remove it if you like. And because what I'm looking at here is sales by category, I made it's easy for me to see my top sellers, my bottom sellers down here at the bottom. maybe I want to look at something a little bit more specific. So maybe let's kind of, or really what I'd like to do is add in some profit information. So I'll do something simple and just type in profit. And again, I don't have to get the syntax right. It'll just populate with sum of profit, and I'll click on that. And here I've got all of our subcategories shown. I'll highlight them one by one, see if there are any outliers that jump out at me. And in fact, this tables one is kind of unusual because basically it is one of the top 4 or 5 sellers, but it's actually the worst in terms of profitability and fairly significant at that. In fact, everything else is hovering right around 0 or highly profitable. This is the only one that's unprofitable by a wide margin. So let's shift our analysis. Instead of looking at sum of sales, maybe I want to look at a different measure. Let's look at discount in this case. And because we're talking about discounts, it probably doesn't make sense to aggregate or sum. Instead, let's look at the average discount. So again, very simple for me to change that. And I see that, again, a fairly high discount rate, and again, still one of the only ones that are lacking in profit. So let's keep this. Let's filter to just that, and I'll say only tables. And Ask Data will populate with the appropriate syntax for me to go ahead and select. All right, so now that we've got the that single item, single subcategory, let's actually add in a lower level and drill down to product name. So let's just type in product name. And again, Tableau will populate with the appropriate syntax. And now I've got the full list, and I can start to identify that all of them have a discount average, or an average discount of 15% or more. And they all seem to be pretty unprofitable. Okay, so now that I've started to identify a particular problem, maybe what I want to do is just render a list. So we'll change this from a scatter plot to a bar chart. And I see here that I've got, if I'm eyeballing it, around 50, about 50 or so rows of data. That's maybe a little bit more than I want. In fact, if I select them all, I see that I've got the 56. Yeah, that's more than I really want. So let's just focus on just the most significant offenders here. So I'll just type in low profits. And I see that it's actually sorted in the average discounts and filtered the list. Maybe it's still a little bit too long. So let's come in here and get a little bit more specific with the low profits and say, instead of the range that Ask Data has made an educated guess on, we'll just say show me at show me at most 0. So everything under 0. And you know what, that still might be a little bit more than I want, so let's go ahead and remove that. And let's get very specific and say worst products. Now again, you can slice and dice, or you can really narrow this down any number of ways. Just by typing in product, are we referring to product name, product ID, and how are we defining worst, right? Rather than having to go into a menu and specifically build it into a filter, I can go off of one of the suggestions that Ask Data has provided. Worst in terms of number of records, or worst in terms of profit. So we'll just say worst, and again, it narrows it down to the single one, which of course we can always change. So instead of a bottom 1, we want to make a bottom 10 list. And there we go. So really what we've done to this point is we've connected to data, or connected to a published data source, and sight unseen, without having to learn any sort of navigation or menu options. We've really just used Ask Data in the syntax that we would normally use with Google. And we've identified a problem, we've drilled down, narrowed it down to a specific set of information that we want to continue to monitor. So at this point, I'm just going to save. And we'll save this in the sales sandbox, embed the password, and I'll give it a name. Book Levine. And now what you'll see is how integrated this is to the Tableau platform. Because now this is opening up in just the default Tableau server or Tableau Online interface for a user to consume and interact with this information. For example, someone else may be able to open this up and come in and edit this. So the view that was created in Ask Data, we're now doing a full-on web edit here. So perhaps we want to look at a regional slice on this information to see if there's anything that jumps out at us. And maybe we'll tailor the view somehow to say, let's incorporate sales into this. And I think we found an outlier. We have certainly a significant amount of sales for this one particular product name that happens to be in the South. And if I click on that, I can look at the underlying data to get the full details for that particular outlier. So now that we've got that, I'll go ahead and say save. And again, this is the full integration end-to-end between Ask Data and the default Tableau platform here. So now that I've got that saved, I may want to make others aware of this finding. I'll do that with a subscription. And I'll add my director, Kurt. And you know what, seeing that this is a fairly important finding, we really need to run this hourly, every hour on the hour, 7 days a week. So Kurt, sorry you're going to get all the emails, but this is pretty significant. And rather than tempt fate, I'm actually not going to go through with that subscription, but I think you get the idea. So let me pivot back over to the presentation here. And again, now that you've seen what Ask Data can do, let's talk a little bit more about some of the semantics. So Tableau already has built-in concepts for enhancing your data model. In my opinion, it's one of the key benefits of the platform in terms of the ease of use. And we saw this earlier when we simply connected the data while we were in Tableau Desktop. And we saw how Tableau automatically applies geocoding, understands and treats various data types appropriately, such as date fields, and provides basic statistical functions. For example, Tableau has native geocoding for geographic fields that it recognizes within your data. The product ships with an internal database containing the latitude and longitude information for geographic fields like country, city, state, and zip, so that you don't have to go through that exercise. You can answer questions about the mean, the median, average, count distinct, etc., without having to create those aggregations for each measure or dimension. And Tableau picks up on that even if it's not in the underlying data. And you can drill down on dates or change the date part. Another example of how Tableau understands what we as human beings understand about date hierarchies. We know that a week is 7 days. You and I can simply look at a date that shows 3/12/19 and understand that it's associated with March. It's the 12th day of the month. It belongs to the year 2019 and so forth. So NLP, the natural language processing component of Ask Data, it simply leverages all of this out of the box, and therefore the semantic data model is automatically enriched. But beyond that built-in enrichment, your organization may also have its own terminology. Ask Data allows users to add in synonyms for any or all of the fields in the data source. And that's a big part of the beauty of Ask Data, because not all users are going to be aware of the official, or more importantly, single name for a particular column of data. Every organization has a living, breathing taxonomy for how to refer to certain pieces of information that happens to be at the fingertips of the user base, and that taxonomy is usually pretty fluid. And when dealing with software applications and computer systems, it has to be precise, like we talked about earlier. a user has to know which field to call by its exact name so that they can include it on a report. Well, Ask Data enables you to break through that obstacle by incorporating your own synonyms into the data model so that end users don't have to be that precise. Let's take a look. Okay, so let me go back into, let me find that data source. And let's go ahead and just add in some synonyms. So for example, sales is not the only way to refer to that. We can call it revenue. We could also, call it income. Forgot to add that one in. And we could do the same thing with customer name. So we could call these client, consumer, shopper, and on and on and on. And then finally I'll add one in for region here, territory. So again, that analysis is happening in the background. But now what that means is, if I start to type in total revenue, Tableau or Ask Data is smart enough to recognize the connection there and populate it with the suggestion of sum of sales. And on top of that, by state, so we're incorporating that geographic field, which again is identified with the globe icon. Just by typing it in, Tableau populates it with a map. Now again, think back to the connection we made to actually establish this data source. All we did was point Tableau to the data, or to the database, and it picked up on the geocoding, right? So that's not a step we had to go through manually, it's automatic. So here you're seeing the synonyms in conjunction with the basic Tableau metadata model coming into play for the simplicity of the user. And the same is true here. Let's put in, I may have I may just have a question, or I'm curious about the number of customers we have, right? Count of consumer. And so Tableau does the scan of count of customer name, and it populates the value there. And I may just want to see how that number changes over time. So I'll just type in by month. And it's going to suggest by order dates month. And you saw in that data, go back to Tableau Desktop here, the date field for order date is simply that. It's literally just the month, day, the year, and the time. But from that, Tableau is extrapolating out all those different date parts. So, perhaps we may be curious about number of customers by weekday. No one had to build that concept into the metadata model. It's built there for us. Let's just change this to a bar chart. And so from that, Tableau picks up all those different components. And so it really allows the user to explore at will without having to have anything defined for them at the beginning. So now what we'll do is we'll talk about some of the analytics that are built in and kind of get into some of the best practices on how to use Ask Data. And then we'll also talk a little bit more about some of the underlying smart technology that you may not notice that's right under the hood. So one of the key aspects of Ask Data is that it was built with simplicity in mind, and its intent is to allow anyone, expert or novice, to ask questions of their information. And here within Ask Data, you don't have to think about the interface. You can simply focus on the question in hand. As I mentioned before, there are no menu options to deal with. No, you don't need to know where to find a function or anything like that. So Ask Data supports the core analytical functions of Tableau, including aggregations, grouping, sorting, and various levels of filtering. So for aggregations, example phrases like you've seen so far, they include, sum of sales, average profit, count of customers. But you can also use common synonyms for these terms, like mean for average, or simply just type in CNT for count. For grouping, you just have to include the word by. So like we saw in the demo, by region or by product. And if you're familiar with creating a visualization in Tableau currently, this is the equivalent of placing a dimension on the columns or row shelf. There are quite a few ways to filter. As we saw, Ask Data lets you filter data down to a numerical range and then fine-tune that as needed. So examples could be sum of sales at least 2,000, or prices between 10 and 20. And for text values, categorical filters let you narrow down to the specific ones you're interested in, using terms like is not, starts with, ends with, contains, that type of thing. And then time filtering, Ask Data supports this with phrases like sales in the last 10 years, or profit, between 2012 and 2014. And of course, you can use synonyms like previous, last, following, next, starting at, ending at. And by the way, towards the end of the presentation, I'll be showing you where you can find the full list within the product documentation. And you can quickly see the top and bottom values of a field with phrases like top 10 cars sold last year, or bottom region by profit. And Ask Data also supports common terms that people tend to use in everyday language, like low, high, lowest, highest. And what's also nice is with currency-based fields, you can use terms like cheap for low and expensive for high. And finally, examples of sorting include sort products in ascending order, by a measure of some sort, or sort customer name in alphabetical order. And similar to the concept that I just mentioned with the cheap or expensive, you can also use synonyms for sorting like from smallest for ascending, or from largest descending. So let's see some of these in action here. Let's go back into Ask Data. And I'll just clear out my question. And I'll just say, how many customers? And you see here that the translation engine is coming into play with distinct count of customer ID or customer name. And then we'll apply the grouping by region. And then as far as filtering out, let's say we only want to look at certain customers with sales at least 1,000. And of course, I can change that to say, well, instead of 10,000, let's see how many high-end customers we have with 10,000. And I see that I've had 2 customers in the East, 1 in the other 3 regions. So here's a good example of the aggregations, the grouping, and the filtering, all done simply just from the text box there. And then let's look at the top 10 customers by, and again, this is an example where you can do a top 10. It depends on what type of breakdown you're looking for. This could be by sales. This could be by number of orders or number of records. So I'll just say top 10 customers by number of records. And I see that the default is to sort them descending, but maybe I want to put together an alphabetical list. So I'll just say sort, and actually populated already there. So sort customer name in alphabetical order. So now let's pivot to some of the underlying technologies that are fairly sophisticated, but again are somewhat subtle, so you may not notice them. But nonetheless, they are designed to really enhance the usability. So number one, it's piggybacking on top of the traditional Tableau engine, and you see here that we've got a geocoded field on this view, so average points by country. So based on, built on the way that Tableau has always operated, the viz type will default to the optimal layout based on the data elements that have come into play. So here we've included the geographical field in the question, so Tableau renders the map appropriately. And the same would be true with a date field in the result of a line chart or creating a scatter plot when multiple measures are selected. Another example of this would be the default sort order when a view is first rendered within within Ask Data, and this definitely allows for easier analytical comparison. And so, you certainly can change this very simply, just like we saw, right from within the framework of Ask Data by typing in sort by this field alphabetically or ascending or descending. But it is nice that it's already done for you so that the users can save a step or two. And by the way, I think we'd all love to see this included in Tableau Desktop and Server and online. So we'll stay tuned and we'll see if we'll put that in. Misspelling, this might be my personal favorite, or second favorite that is, after the unlimited undo button. But I feel like our product team specifically had me in mind when they built this because I'm an absolutely terrible typer. I think my most common key is the backspace. But the ability to interpret what the user is asking for, even when what they're typing doesn't match keystroke for keystroke, is incredibly helpful. And again, so the idea is bridging that gap between approximate and exact. Ambiguity resolution. So you see here that the users typed in 2012 lines. Well, that 2012 could be really a number of different things. It could be the year or the vintage. It could be the number of records. It could be the price. To a computer, it's just a number, but the ranking algorithm determines what the most likely possibility is. And again, that's also based on the past usage of this particular data source. And you see that the most likely selections kind of bubble up to the top there. And then we've seen one example of this already with the underspecified utterances. Here, when we enter in wine price over time, well, what does over time mean exactly? It's not specific in the least. So Ask Data picks up on the association that the vintage column in this data source, in this case, it's actually a date and time field, so it includes that as a factor when determining what to pop up in the suggestions there. And again, it also takes that a step further by creating the line chart out of the results instead of any other type of visualization, since that's how we as human beings most effectively interpret data over time. And so really what you're seeing here is essentially the translation between computer speak and human speak. Maximum price, that's computer speak. Most expensive is human speak. For example, would you go into a wine shop and ask, what's your maximum price for a bottle of wine? No, you'd go in and ask, what are some of your most expensive wines? And look at that top image. Consider going into a wine shop and asking any single one of the suggested phrases here. You wouldn't do that, but you would ask the phrase being typed into the text box. So you can basically think of what's being typed into the text box and what pops up in the suggestions as the translation from one language to another and back, because that's what's happening. It's human language to machine language and back. And of course, that bottom image, the bottom image is a perfect example of that. You wouldn't ask someone to sort the taster name in descending order by some of number of records. You'd say, who's the most popular taster? So ultimately, Ask Data is performing all of these tasks simultaneously. If we consider the question from the very start of the presentation, how are recent sales for chairs in Cali? We see what Ask Data is doing behind the scenes. It's handling the vagueness by picking up on the concept of recent, referring to time, and suggesting a starting point of the last 3 weeks. It's identifying the tie between sum of sales, the actual column of data, and the term that the user is substituting for that, income. It's scanning and cataloging the data elements within the columns to find the correct entry. And it's leveraging the built-in knowledge that already exists within Tableau to understand how to represent that data effectively. And so finally, we'd like to show you a couple of resources and discuss some best practices that are available for you. First and foremost, ideally, you'd like to anticipate what types of questions I think it's fair that users may have, because I think it's fairly common when building out a data source in Tableau is to simply connect it to a series of tables and publish that up and with the idea that it can answer any question that a user may have. But that does pose some challenges. For example, from a usability standpoint, all of a sudden the user may be looking at hundreds of columns that might not be relevant and certainly could appear overwhelming. So from a best practices standpoint, you really want to curate this data source and make sure that it's effective for the types of questions that the users will generally be asking. And you can certainly use things like Tableau Prep to go about shaping and joining that information. You also want to create any sort of calculated fields or hierarchical drill downs, geographic, categorical, that type of thing. And again, from a simplification standpoint, the less that the user, not only do you put fewer columns up there for the users to sift through, but there's also less work for the engine to do on the back end. Because if you publish up maybe 100 or so fields, and the users may only be needing 20 or 30 of them, well, the engine's going to be indexing all of them, so that's 70 or 80 columns that are really irrelevant for the use case that the engine is still cataloging. And by the way, we do have some examples, let me pull this up here. We have some resources for you up here. I'm going to minimize this just a little bit just so I can see all the tabs there. All right. We'll go through some of these more specifically, but here I've got the out-of-the-box documentation that's available on the Tableau website, and you'll see there's a section on automatically building views with Ask Data. We won't go through this one by one, but the idea here is that it'll show you some of the syntaxes you can use, how to add synonyms, and some general tips for success, again, using keywords. And then we also have how to optimize data for, or how to optimize your data source for Ask Data. So there's some overlap here in terms of what I'm showing in the PowerPoint and what's available on the site here, but just wanted to make that available for you. And then we also have some resources that are available. One specifically is going to be the interactive demo. So we have a page out here that if you just go to tableau.com and type in Ask Data, I know that URL isn't showing that exactly, but it'll redirect you to that page where you actually will have a full interactive demo to try out for yourself. Quick, less than a minute long video, but more importantly, brings you right to the data source list. So you've got about 5 or 6 different available data sources to play around with, actually a little bit longer list. So feel free to try that out for yourself, tableau.com/askdata. We also have a white paper on some guides for how to prep how to actually prepare your data appropriately, as well as a blog post. Let me cycle through these. Here we go. So here's the link to the blog post, and again, we can make these available so that you don't have to copy them down here. And then we also have a 2019.1 webinar series that we actually run on various topics. And by the way, this there's also another page called tableau.com/new-features. You don't have to put in the products there. But that takes you to a full list of available features in the 2019.1 version, of which Ask Data is one of them. So if you want to learn more about any of these, really the main ones that were included in 2019.1 were Ask Data, Tableau Prep Conductor, and the redesign of the mobile app. So feel free to give that a quick look. And then finally, before we take a look at the Q&A panel, I just want to remind everyone that this is a series that we run every month. So the next one will be Tuesday, April 9th at the same time. It's going to be on Tableau Server. And with that, I do just want to thank everyone for your interest, for taking the time today, and I hope that you found it helpful. So with that, I will look at the Q&A panel. If I can, there we go. And Kurt, if I could, since you've been monitoring this more closely than I have, I may just have you come off mute just so I can check in with you and see which ones we still need answers on.
Sorry, Rob. Yeah, we have responded to all but the last couple of questions. Looks like there's a question around any plans to bring this to the desktop version. Rob, do you have anything to say along those lines?
That's a great question. It's one that we've heard before. Since I'm not in product management, I'm not at liberty to give an official answer on that. So that may just be something that we'll have to wait and see.
Alrighty, and then I think that is it. I see a question from someone asking about some type of an algorithm. This is from Hermont. Can you be a little more specific about the question you're asking, Hermont? Looks like I haven't gotten any further detail on that. So we'll go down to the next question around row-level security. Rob, do you have anything you can say about row-level security in Ask Data?
Yes. So row-level security is applied there. Bear in mind that means that if just as it does in Tableau Desktop or Tableau Server already, that any aggregations will be factored in there. So if there are elements of the data that you're not at liberty to see, then of course the aggregations will of course carry over as well.
Right.
But it does take that into account.
Alrighty. I think that is that's the end of the questions that I see in the queue.
Okay. Well, again, we do want to thank you for taking the time today. We hope that you found this helpful, and we also hope that you would check out the available demo site here. So again, if you go to tableau.com/askdata, let me pull that up one more time. That'll take you exactly where you need to go. And with that, thank you very much for attending today's webinar.